But for a moment, let's try to look at the strategies these leaders are mulling, the kind of measures they're taking to limit the Russian advance. Also, what about Putin's plans? What does he plan to do next, now that his troops have encircled Kiev? To discuss this, I'm being joined by my colleagues. We have Benji Iyer from Washington, D.C., Giles Gibson will be with us from Moscow, Chris Jones from London, and Trent Murray from Berlin. Benji, let's start with you. The US president met G7 leaders last evening. He's also announced additional sanctions on Russia. What can you tell us about his strategy and the steps that he plans to take?
Well, Joe Biden now going even further than sanctions. He's ordered his military to send 7,000 extra troops to Eastern Europe, although he stresses these troops will not be engaged directly in combat. They are there simply to reassure and to assist NATO allies in the region. Note that Ukraine, of course, not one of those NATO allies. But as you noted, Mr. Biden's main strategy still seems to be, along with other allies, going down the route of sanctions, arguing that this is going to prevent Vladimir Putin, his oligarch allies, from being able to carry out business, especially at the 4 largest banks there. But there's still a lot of disagreement over banning Russia's access to different international payment systems. Mr. Biden argues that actually he's not able to pursue with that direction because of Europe. It's the EU which is becoming hesitant around whether to take that particular step. There is, I should add, some optimism within the United States this morning. Former director of the CIA, David Petraeus, says actually, despite there being significant damage, death toll, advance of Russian troops coming through Ukraine, he feels that he's been slightly underwhelmed by the progress so far, and that it's inspiring to see NATO allies come together in the way they have, for example, in the past couple of hours at a virtual emergency summit. The alternative, of course, is that Russia continues in its advance. It takes Kiev, it puts in some sort of puppet government, and then they're left in a situation where the invasion's over. There's essentially an occupation against which Ukrainian civilians will have to essentially start an insurgency.
So, if I've got this right, the entire strategy is around securing Eastern Europe, not so much helping Ukraine, but reassuring the NATO allies, and reassurances will not be enough for Kiev at this point. Benji, reports also saying that the US has reached out to several countries in order to get Russia to the talking table. In fact, Joe Biden has himself stated that he's going to have consultations with India, as he put it, regarding this. What do we know about Washington reaching out to New Delhi?
Well, for a long time, the White House has been trying to pursue a path of diplomacy. For weeks now, attempts to get round the negotiating table, but a lot of those attempts have been unsuccessful. The White House continues to pursue that strategy, as you say, with different partners around the world, including India. But ultimately, many feel that we're past that point now, whereby dialogue and discussion simply aren't going to help. There were further potential talks between Russia and Ukraine, maybe in Belarus, but again, the grounds for those are not something that both sides are agreeing on. And therefore, we're left in a situation where Western allies are going to have to try to find potentially a different way forward. The priority in the United States, though, remains defending NATO allies in the region. Article 5 of the NATO treaty sets out very clearly that if one of those nations are attacked by Russia, by anybody else, then the US is bound by international law to come to their defence. And then we'd essentially be in a situation where the United States is waging war on Russia.
Giles, Russia says that it's ready to talk to Ukraine. Only the Ukrainian armed forces lay down their arms. What do you make of this statement? And what kind of talks can happen while a full-scale invasion is on, and the kind of invasion in which Russia clearly has the upper hand?
We've been hearing from Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for President Putin, talking about how the Kremlin, Russia, is open to holding negotiations, talks with the Ukrainians in the capital of Belarus, Minsk. We've also heard in previous hours from a Ukrainian government official talking about how they are willing to discuss becoming neutral in terms of whether they want to become a member of NATO or not. Also, another key bit of diplomacy going on in the last few hours. We've had reports from Chinese state media saying that Vladimir Putin has had a telephone conversation with the Chinese president Xi Jinping, and Chinese state media saying that Xi told Putin that he supports negotiations going on between the Ukrainians and the Russians.
Trent, in fact, I wanted to come to Chris first. I think London's strategy is also centered around sanctions. We've heard that the UK is planning to shut Russian banks out of its financial system, and Putin's former son-in-law, who lives in the UK, could also come under some kind of sanctions. What more can you tell us about Boris Johnson's strategy?
Yeah, well, Boris Johnson and the UK government has placed many sanctions on hundreds of businesses, Russian oligarchs, and also certain wealthy individuals as well. We've heard earlier that Boris Johnson had a conversation with Ukraine's President Zelensky over what more could be done. Zelensky is basically pleading with his Western allies, saying that not all sanctions have been exhausted just yet. Really, the strategy revolves around damaging Russia economically and making sure that they can no longer afford to essentially push any further into Ukraine. Now, one of the things that they haven't put in place, that the UK hasn't sanctioned on Russia, is the removal of the Russian kind of traders from the financial global system, SWIFT. Now, SWIFT is essentially a huge financial system that allows countries, businesses and traders to make overseas payments more easily. Trillions of dollars are made each day through this system. Now, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss in the UK says that the UK is working with allies to exclude Russia from SWIFT, from the SWIFT financial system as soon as possible. Now, that's not been put in place just yet, but conversations are ongoing with NATO and with EU allies to see if they can make that happen.
And the German Chancellor is not someone who's in favor of this. Trent, he has opposed cutting Russia off SWIFT. He says such measures could be reserved for the future. What would such a future entail? How much more aggression does Russia have to show to qualify for these measures?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because less than 48 hours after Germany was getting international praise for halting Nord Stream 2, it once again finds itself having to answer some very uncomfortable questions within its alliances. Of course, the main issue now is that removal of Russia from the SWIFT banking system. That would be an immediate and strong move that would really rattle the Russian economy, because it would effectively mean they could no longer transfer money back and forth overseas. Now, I've been trying to get an answer today from the German government about why they are so resistant to do this, and what I've been pointed to is a statement by the spokesperson for the German Chancellor. He's spoken about this this afternoon. They've given several reasons. I'll let you decide whether they're satisfactory. One is it's technically very complex to do. Secondly, it would massively affect German businesses that are doing business with Russian businesses. Three, it would mean that there's a high risk that Germany would no longer be supplied with gas. In other words, they'll have no one to send the money to pay the gas for Germany. Now, of course, you have to remember Germany gets about 50% of its gas from Russia, so it's very nervous about any disruptions to supplies and what that could cause. I'm not sure those answers will satisfy other members of the EU who are now lining up in a greater number demanding that Russia be kicked out of the SWIFT system.
Well, I would say the degree may vary, but this could be said of all the leaders in the Western Bloc who've put their own interests, I think, above Ukrainian interests at this point. But thanks very much. We'll be tracking the story with all of you, Benji, Giles, Chris and Trent. Thank you for those updates. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.